Hi everyone, and thank you very much for joining me again on another edition of PressCast. I'm Fabs, your host, and today I will be talking to Lindsay Koshgarian, co-author of the report called The State of Insecurity, Cost of Militarization Since 9/11, which essentially says that the United States has spent over $21 trillion since 9/11 on domestic and foreign militarization. But before I start the conversation, don't forget to click the subscribe button and the like button here. And in case you're listening to us on SoundCloud, don't forget to follow us. So if you're ready, let's begin. Ms. Kashkarian, or maybe I should call you Lindsay, thank you very much for coming on PressCast, taking the time and being with us.
Sure, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. And let's dive into real stuff, and that's the interesting report that I read about, you helped me with the title, the militarization, the cost of militarization since 9/11. And,
That's right.
Pretty interesting. So why don't you walk us through how you worked on that? Tell us a little bit about the numbers, because, we are just turning into 20 years since the event that put in motion a lot of pieces and changed a lot of things. And we now are, looking back and seeing a legacy that is not really, I don't know, why am I talking about it? So take it away from me.
Yeah, so we wanted to look, it's been 20 years since 9/11, and the US response to 9/11 has changed the United States and the world. And we wanted to look at what the US has spent on all of this response. And that includes everything from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to the US remaking of our own immigration system here and our expansion of the powers of federal law enforcement. So the US response to 9/11 has included a lot more than just the wars. It's also included a lot of things that have increased militarization and oppression here in the United States. And we wanted to look at what all of this has cost us, especially because right now the US is facing, as is the rest of the world, a pandemic and a climate crisis and other problems that really require major investments in order to solve them. And what we found is that over the last 20 years, we've spent $21 trillion on war and the military and militarizing our own society here in the United States.
Lindsay, Mr. Biden said that the cost of war in Afghanistan was about 2 trillion. First, do you think that number is valid? And so, from 2 million to 21 million, that's a huge gap. So where else did this money go?
Yeah, so it's trillion, first of all, which is way, way, way more than a million. But 2 trillion is about right for the war in Afghanistan, um, but that's only a part of it. The rest of the money, there's a study by the Cost of War Project at Brown University that showed that the wars overall have added up to 8 trillion so far. So the Afghanistan war is actually a relatively small part of that. But what the president isn't counting is all of the other spending that the US has done on our military. We have wars, a war in Afghanistan, we had a war in Iraq, but the war on terror that the US military engaged in expanded to 85 countries. And that included countries where the US was involved in training militaries, countries where the US was involved in direct combat, countries where the US was engaging in drone strikes. So there's a lot of activity that was part of the war on terror that wasn't just limited to Afghanistan. Now, there also was a huge military buildup that went behind that. So the US is spending almost twice now what we were on our military prior to 9/11. And the majority of that has not gone directly to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but it is related, and it was spurred by the US response to 9/11. And some of what that pays for are 750 military installations around the world. Many of them are not directly related to the war on terror, but they are the US military presence all over the world. we send about 200,000 troops that we have permanently based overseas at any given time. And we spend 10 as much as the next 10 countries combined on our military. So it includes all of that military spending. And the total on our military over the last 20 years is 16 trillion. So that's the vast majority of
Wow.
what we're talking about.
Wow. So, I'm just curious, where did you get your numbers? I mean, was it easy to access all this data?
So the US publishes budget numbers through a few places. We use numbers from the Office of Management and Budget, which is a part of the White House, actually. And every year, when the president puts out their budget proposal for the coming year, they also put out data on what the US has spent on things over the last, it actually goes all the way back to 1976, but we were particularly interested in these past 20 years. So we used published data from the federal government from that source, and that is where almost all of our calculations came from.
Hmm. I'm sorry, I just jumped right into the questions and then didn't ask. So, to frame this conversation a little better, why don't you give us a little bit of introduction? I mean, how did you get involved in all these numbers? What did you study? And then, you know, that helps a lot, the audience and me included.
Yes. Well, I did get a master's degree in public policy. So I've been interested in public policy questions for a long time. I was actually primarily interested in poverty in the U.S. when I started. But one of the things that we see so often in U.S. politics is that politicians claim that we can't afford programs to end poverty here in the United States. And so that connects to this question of, where is our money going? What are we spending money on? Why can't we afford those poverty programs? And the answer is that we can afford it. We just aren't choosing to invest our money that way. Um, Now, my interest goes back much farther um, to mostly US domestic politics, but I became interested in this mostly because of the budget questions of sort of what are our priorities and where are we spending money?
Lindsay, one of the things that always shocks outsiders about, the United States is the cost of healthcare. So it's also just a running meme around internet about how shocking sometimes, the bills for very simple things for Americans are. And then my question is, could that money, even like a tiny fraction of it, have gone to healthcare so that Americans wouldn't have to pay that much?
Yes, so the U.S. has one of the most expensive healthcare systems in the world, and we, among wealthy countries, we provide some of the least generous health benefits to our citizens. Um, so yes, we could have spent some of that money differently. A couple of the ways that we look at where we might spend that money differently, and not just thinking about how we could have done things differently over the last 20 years, because obviously we can't change that, but looking forward to the next 20 years and what are we going to do for the next 20 years. We found that for less than a quarter of what we've spent on militarization for the last 20 years, we could invest in a decarbonized, fully renewable electric grid for the US, which is something that we desperately need, something that we absolutely could have invested in 20 years ago. We didn't make that choice, but 20 years from now, we need to have that done. We can't be looking 20 years from now at a situation where we're still dependent on fossil fuels for our energy. So that's one of the things that we could be doing instead. There also is a major problem with unemployment and with low wages in the United States. So we said that for $2.3 trillion, we could create 5 million jobs paying $15 an hour, which is what's considered sort of the minimum livable wage here in the United States. And we could create those jobs for 10 years for $2.3 trillion, 5 million of them. So there are quite a few things that we should be doing with this money instead. What we unfortunately are seeing is that the administration and Congress right now are continuing forward with the path of high spending on militarization. The Biden administration has requested to spend even more than the Trump administration on our military. They are keeping funding for our immigration system, ICE, which does our deportations, and our border patrol. They're looking to keep the funding for those things at the same level that it was under President Trump. And President Trump increased the spending on those things tremendously. So we're not looking at a very good picture right now. But there are members of Congress who are looking to change this and who are working with us to try to reduce Pentagon spending and shift it. And we also have polling that shows that the majority of people in the United States want to cut Pentagon spending by 10% and shift it into domestic priorities.
Lindsay, a great chunk of, as you mentioned in your report, this money went to private contractors. And then whenever you read about an American conflict anywhere, you definitely, head into some of the names of the contractors. So just could you just break it down for me and my audience who these contractors are, and then how does this work? I mean, how did it get? I mean, yeah, go ahead and explain it. I'll ask later.
Yes. So what we found is that over the last 20 years, I mentioned we've spent $16 trillion on our military, and $7 trillion of that, more than half of it, went to military contractors. So it's a hugely profitable industry. There was also another study that showed that if you bought $10,000 worth of defense stocks at the beginning of the war on terror, and today they would be worth $100,000. So it's been a huge profit maker for a lot of people and for the industries that have been involved. Now, the biggest military contractor in the United States for many years has been Lockheed Martin, and they're the maker of the F-35 jet fighter, which has cost billions of dollars more than it was promised, and has not even done what the Pentagon wants it to do. We buy about almost 100 more of these jets every year at a cost of about $10 billion to $12 billion. So it's a hugely profitable program for Lockheed Martin. And we give Lockheed Martin takes every year more than $40 billion in government contracts and in Pentagon contracts. And that's almost three times the budget of the CDC during the pandemic, which is our Center for Disease Control budget during the pandemic was $16 billion. And every single year we are giving Lockheed Martin more than 40 billion.
Wow, that's a lot of money. And then it's no secret. You and I know very well that big money talks, and then the rest of us are just, pawns. So big corporations have always been dictating the future of the rest of the world, and then there is no denying it. And then, is there any way that we can stop it, apart from just trying to spread the word and then try to enlighten the public? Is there any actual way that you can, just channel this money to go to the American public rather than go to making bombs?
Well, here in the United States, the best way to do that is for people to contact their members of Congress. There are members of Congress who are not supportive of this system. Um, you know, Going back 20 years ago, there was only one member of Congress in the US who voted against the war in Afghanistan. But today, there are several dozen who are more progressive on foreign policy, who want to spend less on the Pentagon and more on other things. And so what we need to do is support those members of Congress and encourage other members of Congress to join them. And we have movements that are doing that here in the United States. We have organizers who are working on that, and the members of Congress who are supportive of this in Congress are also working on convincing their colleagues in Congress to join them. Just last year, we had more than 90 members of the House of Representatives vote in support of a 10% cut to the Pentagon budget. And now that is far less than half, which is what we would need to actually win it. But it is several times more than we had on a similar vote just a couple of years ago. So we're making progress.
Okay, that's a great job. I wish you all the best, and I hope that you can succeed in the path that you've taken. Lindsay, have you been following? Actually, I think you have, but have you been following the events in Afghanistan?
Yes, I have. Yes.
So, I mean, do you have anything to tell us about it? I mean, I know that you're a numbers person, but let's talk a little bit of politics. So, what do you think? What went wrong in Afghanistan?
What went wrong was the entire 20 years went wrong. And this was not a secret. This is something that the Pentagon leadership has known for many years. The Washington Post did a big expose of the Pentagon's programs and work in Afghanistan in 2019 that showed that the Pentagon kept representing what they were doing in Afghanistan as a success. They kept saying what we're doing is working. We're remaking Afghan society. We've created this government and this army, and it's all going great. But it was never true. It was never true, and Pentagon leadership knew that it wasn't true. And they kept saying that what they were doing was working to justify the continued presence and justify the continued investment. But it was never working. So the fact that, what we've seen now in Afghanistan, with Afghanistan falling to the Taliban immediately after the US left, that's not a problem with the US withdrawal. That was a problem with the US occupation from the beginning.
Very interesting. Lindsay, that was great to have you here with us. And there's one last thing that I need to ask you is that, end the show for us. So let us know anything that I might have forgot to ask you, your ending comments, anything that you want to share with us. Please go.
Well, I will just say that I think that, here in the United States, we can be awfully focused on ourselves and our own policy. And so I appreciate your taking the time to hear my point of view today. And I hope that, people in the United States will also take the time to hear points of view from people from other parts of the world.